Mike Henderson had been staring at the monstrosity in his backyard for 3 years, and today was finally the day he'd do something about it. The above-ground pool that had once been his pride and joy now looked like a giant blue eyesore, its water a murky green soup that could probably support its own ecosystem. What had started as a pandemic purchase to keep his kids entertained had become a maintenance nightmare that he'd simply given up on. "All right, let's get this thing torn down," he muttered to himself, pulling on his work gloves as he surveyed the 24-foot circular beast that dominated his modest backyard. Mike had done his research. The pool had to go, the liner was shot, the pump had died twice, and his homeowner's insurance had started asking uncomfortable questions about liability. More importantly, his wife Sarah had been dropping not-so-subtle hints about wanting a vegetable garden for months. That space could grow enough tomatoes to feed the whole neighborhood, she said just last week, staring meaningfully out the kitchen window. He started by draining the remaining water, watching years of neglect swirl down the storm drain. The process was oddly therapeutic, like finally dealing with a problem he'd been avoiding for far too long. Mike had taken a week off work specifically for this project, and he was determined to have the entire pool disassembled and hauled away before Sarah and the kids returned from visiting her mother. It was while he was disconnecting the filtration system that he first noticed her. Karen Middleton stood at the fence line between their properties, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who'd just discovered a personal affront. Her perfectly manicured lawn stretched behind her like a golf course, not a dandelion in sight, contrasting sharply with Mike's more relaxed approach to yard maintenance. "Excuse me," Karen called out, her voice carrying that particular tone that immediately put Mike on edge. "What exactly are you doing to my view?" Mike paused, wrench in hand, and looked up at his neighbor. They'd exchanged pleasantries over the fence a handful of times in the 5 years since he'd moved in, but this was the first time Karen had ever seemed particularly interested in his backyard activities. Taking down the pool, he replied simply, gesturing at the obvious dismantling operation around him. Finally decided it was more trouble than it's worth. Karen's expression shifted from annoyed to something approaching panic. "You can't just tear down the pool. I've been looking at that beautiful blue water for years. It's part of the neighborhood aesthetic." Mike blinked, certain he misheard. "I'm sorry. What?" "That pool has been there since you moved in," Karen continued, her voice rising slightly. "I specifically chose the dining room table placement in my breakfast nook to have a view of the water. It's like having lakefront property. You can't just destroy that without consulting the neighbors who are affected." The absurdity of the statement hit Mike like a physical blow. His neighbor was actually arguing that his pool, his property, his expense, his liability, somehow belonged to her by virtue of her ability to see it. He set down his wrench and turned to face Karen fully, trying to process what he was hearing. "Karen, it's my pool, on my property, that I pay for and maintain," he said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "But it affects property values," she shot back, "and the ambience of the entire neighborhood. You should have gotten permission from the homeowners association before making such a drastic change to the landscape." Mike's jaw dropped. They didn't even have a homeowners association. The next morning, Mike was greeted by the sight of Karen standing in his driveway at 7 a.m. sharp, clutching a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. She wore a crisp business suit despite it being Saturday, and her expression suggested she meant serious business. "I've done my research," she announced without preamble, thrusting the folder toward him. "You cannot legally remove that pool without proper notification and environmental impact assessment." Mike, still in his pajamas and holding his morning coffee, stared at the folder like it might bite him. "Karen, what are you talking about?" "It's an above-ground pool in my backyard. Page 12 clearly states that any modification to water features visible from adjacent properties requires a 30-day notice period," Karen said, flipping through papers with the efficiency of a courtroom lawyer. And page 18 outlines the potential environmental hazards of draining chlorinated water into storm systems. Mike opened the folder and immediately recognized printouts from random legal websites highlighted and annotated in Karen's precise handwriting. Most of it appeared to be about commercial pool installations and municipal water features, nothing remotely applicable to his situation. "Karen, this is ridiculous. Half of these are about public pools and the other half are about in-ground installations. My pool is basically a big kiddie pool. A kiddie pool that's been providing scenic value to my property for 3 years," Karen shot back. "Do you have any idea how much I spent on landscaping my breakfast nook specifically to complement that view? The decorative stones alone cost $800. Mike rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. "You spent money on your own landscaping. That's not my problem." But Karen was just getting started. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through photos. "I've documented everything. The way the morning light hits the water, how the pool integrates with the existing fence line, the overall aesthetic harmony it creates. I'm prepared to file a complaint with the city about unauthorized removal of established water features. It's not established. I put it up 3 years ago. 3 years is plenty of time for environmental integration, Karen declared with the confidence of someone who clearly Googled pool removal laws for several hours. Birds drink from it, insects depend on it for their life cycle, and removing it could disrupt the local ecosystem. Mike looked at his pool, still half full of green sludge that looked more like a science experiment than a habitat for anything that wasn't actively decomposing. Karen, the only thing living in that pool is whatever's causing the alga bloom. That's beside the point. Karen straightened her shoulders. I'm calling emergency neighborhood meeting for this evening. 7 o'clock sharp. Everyone needs to understand what you're trying to do here. What I'm trying to do is remove my own pool from my own property. But Karen was already walking away, phone pressed to her ear. Mike caught fragments of her conversation as she headed back to her house. Complete disregard for property values, environmental destruction, clearly needs intervention. By noon, Mike had received 3 phone calls. The first was from Mrs. Chen across the street, politely asking if it was true that he was destroying water access for local wildlife. The second was from Bob Martinez next door, wondering if Mike's pool removal would somehow affect his own property value. The third was from a number he didn't recognize. Apparently, Karen had gotten hold of his contact information and given it to someone from what she called the Neighborhood Beautification Committee, a group Mike was fairly certain didn't exist until that morning. The woman on the phone, who introduced herself as Patricia Holloway, spoke with the measured tone of someone accustomed to dealing with problem homeowners. Mr. Henderson, I understand you're planning some major modifications to your property without consulting the community stakeholders, Patricia said. Mrs. Middleton has raised some valid concerns about the impact on neighborhood aesthetics and property values. It's just a pool, Mike said, his patience wearing thin. An ugly, broken pool that I'm removing from my own backyard. Nevertheless, changes to prominent landscape features affect everyone. I think it would be appropriate for you to attend this evening's meeting and present your case to the community. My case? For removing my own pool? Well, when you put it like that, it sounds rather selfish, doesn't it? Mike hung up and stared at his phone in disbelief. Somehow, in the span of 6 hours, his simple home improvement project had become a neighborhood controversy. He looked out at his backyard, where the pool sat half dismantled, looking worse than ever. That evening, Mike found himself sitting in Karen's living room, surrounded by 8 neighbors he barely knew, all of whom were staring at him like he'd announced plans to build a nuclear reactor. Karen had prepared a PowerPoint presentation. The PowerPoint presentation was titled Project Pool Preservation, Maintaining Community Standards and Property Values. Karen had somehow managed to create 17 slides about Mike's backyard pool, complete with before and after mock-ups showing his yard as a barren wasteland without the aquatic centerpiece. As you can see in slide 14, Karen clicked her laser pointer at a photo she'd clearly taken from her upstairs window. The pool serves as a natural focal point that draws the eye and creates visual harmony with the existing fence structures. Mike sat in stunned silence as his neighbors nodded along. Mrs. Chen raised her hand. Karen, didn't you tell me that Mike was planning to put in a motorcycle repair shop? I never said that, Mike protested, but Karen was already advancing to her next slide. While Mr. Henderson hasn't disclosed his full plans, removing established water features often precedes commercial development, Karen said smoothly. We've all seen what happens when property owners prioritize personal convenience over community welfare. The meeting devolved into a heated discussion about property rights versus community standards, with Karen playing the role of concerned citizen and Mike cast as the neighborhood villain. By the time he escaped an hour later, a petition was being circulated to preserve neighborhood water features, and Karen had volunteered to monitor the situation to ensure no further unauthorized changes occurred. Mike thought the worst was over. He was wrong. The next morning, he woke to find Karen standing in his backyard, clipboard in hand, taking measurements of his pool area. She was wearing what appeared to be a hard hat and a reflective safety vest, as if she were conducting an official inspection. What the hell are you doing in my yard? Mike called out, rushing outside in his bathrobe. Documenting the current state before you cause any more damage, Karen replied without looking up from her clipboard. I'm conducting a pre-demolition assessment for the neighborhood committee. Get out of my yard right now, or I'm calling the police. Karen finally looked up, her expression one of injured innocence. I'm simply protecting community interests. The committee voted unanimously to establish a monitoring protocol. What committee? You can't just make up committees and give yourself authority over other people's property. But Karen was already taking photos of the pool from multiple angles, narrating into her phone. Day 3 of unauthorized demolition project. Subject appears agitated and uncooperative with community oversight efforts. Mike had reached his limit. He marched over and stood directly in front of Karen's camera. You have 30 seconds to get off my property, or I'm calling the cops. Are you threatening me? Karen gasped, suddenly switching from official inspector mode to victim. Everyone, did you hear that? He's threatening a woman who's just trying to protect the neighborhood. Mike spun around to see several neighbors had gathered at various fence lines, apparently drawn by the commotion. Karen had somehow managed to turn his demand that she leave his property into a public spectacle. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm asking you to get out of my backyard. Hostile and aggressive behavior, Karen continued narrating into her phone. Subject refuses to cooperate with legitimate community oversight and appears to be escalating toward physical intimidation. That's when Mike noticed the stakes. While he'd been arguing with Karen, she'd somehow managed to pound several wooden stakes into his lawn connected by bright orange surveyor's tape. The stakes surrounded his pool in a perfect rectangle, with small laminated signs attached. Protect water FEHURA. Do not disturb. What is this? Mike demanded, gesturing at the stakes. Protective barriers, Karen announced proudly. The committee has designated this area as a neighborhood preservation zone pending resolution of the removal dispute. Mike stared at the orange tape surrounding his own pool on his own property. You cannot designate preservation zones in my backyard. We absolutely can under the Neighborhood Beautification Emergency Powers Act, Karen replied with the confidence of someone who clearly just made up that title 5 minutes ago. Mike started pulling up the stakes. They were hammered and surprisingly deep, and Karen had apparently used contractor-grade materials. As he struggled with the first stake, Karen began shouting, "Destruction of official preservation markers. Everyone please witness this. He's destroying community property." It's not community property. It's my yard. But Karen was already on her phone again. Yes, police. I need to report someone destroying official neighborhood preservation barriers and threatening community volunteers. He's completely out of control. Mike froze, stake halfway out on the ground. Around the yard, neighbors were pulling out their own phones, some recording, others apparently also calling for help. The situation had spiraled completely beyond his control. As he stood there, stake in one hand, Karen pointing at him dramatically while speaking urgently into her phone, Mike realized he was probably about to be arrested for removing unauthorized surveyor stakes from his own property. The absurdity of it all hit him like a physical blow. "Sir, are you going to put that down?" Mike turned to see 2 police officers approaching through his backyard gate, hands resting casually on their belts. Karen immediately rushed toward them, clipboard and hard hat making her look like some sort of official inspector. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man has been threatening me and destroying community preservation efforts. I have everything documented." Officer Martinez, a veteran cop who'd seen his share of neighborhood disputes, looked around Mike's backyard with a weary expression of someone who knew this call was going to involve a lot more paperwork than it should. His partner, Officer Kim, was already taking notes as Karen launched into what sounded like a prepared statement. "This man has been conducting unauthorized demolition without proper permits," Karen began, gesturing dramatically at the half-dismantled pool. "When I attempted to conduct a routine community inspection, he became hostile and began destroying official preservation markers." Mike opened his mouth to respond, but Officer Martinez held up a hand. "Let's start with the basics. Sir, what's your name, and do you live here?" "Mike Henderson. This is my house, my yard, and my pool," Mike said, still holding the surveyor's stake he'd been trying to remove. "She came into my backyard without permission and put up these things." Officer Kim walked over to examine the orange tape and wooden stakes. "Ma'am, did you install these markers?" "The Neighborhood Beautification Committee installed protective barriers around the community water feature," Karen replied smoothly. "We have full authority under municipal preservation statutes." "What committee?" Officer Martinez asked. Karen fumbled with her clipboard. "They the officially recognized Neighborhood Oversight Committee. We held a vote. There are minutes." "Do you have documentation of this committee's legal authority?" "Well, not with me, but..." "Ma'am, did you enter this man's property without his permission?" Karen's confident demeanor began to crack. "I was conducting official business. Community preservation takes precedence over individual property claims." Officer Kim looked up from examining the stakes. "These are pretty substantial. Looks like they were installed with concrete footings." Mike stared at the stakes with new horror. "Concrete? You poured concrete in my yard?" "Temporary preservation measures require stable installation," Karen said defensively. Officer Martinez was losing patience. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to explain exactly what authority you believe you have to install anything in someone else's yard." That's when Karen made her fatal mistake. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. "Officers, I think you're missing the bigger picture here," she said, pulling out her phone. "This man has been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. Look at these photos I've taken over the past few days. You can see his yard is becoming a hazard. And just this morning, he physically threatened me when I was trying to protect community assets." She swiped through her phone, showing photos of Mike's yard during the pool demolition. Tools scattered around, equipment staged for removal, the general organized chaos of a home improvement project. See how he's let this become a disaster zone? And here's a recording of him threatening me this morning. Karen played an audio clip on her phone. Mike's voice came through clearly. Get out of my yard right now or I'm calling the police. That's not a threat, Mike protested. I was telling her to leave my property. But Karen wasn't finished. Officers, I hate to say this, but I'm genuinely concerned for my safety. His behavior has been escalating, and I think he might be having some kind of breakdown. Look at him. He's still holding that stake like a weapon. Mike looked down at the surveyor's stake in his hand and suddenly realized how the situation might appear to the officers. A man in his backyard, holding what could be construed as a club, with his neighbor claiming he'd threatened her. Sir, I'm going to need you to put that down, Officer Martinez said, his tone shifting to something more official. Mike carefully set the stake on the ground, his heart sinking as he realized Karen had somehow managed to flip the narrative completely. Officers, she's the one who trespassed. She installed these things without permission. I was just trying to remove them from my own property. He's been like this for days, Karen continued, her voice taking on a tremor that Mike was certain hadn't been there moments before. Hostile, aggressive, making threats. I'm scared to be in my own backyard. Officer Kim was examining Karen's documentation. Ma'am, these printouts about pool regulations. They're not local ordinances. Most of this appears to be about commercial installations. I did extensive research, Karen replied quickly. The principles apply. And this committee you mentioned, do you have any official documentation? Meeting minutes? Registration with the city? Karen's pause was telling. The committee formed organically in response to this crisis. We haven't had time for all the bureaucratic paperwork. Officer Martinez was starting to get the picture. So he formed a committee, gave it authority, and used that authority to install barriers on someone else's property. For community protection, Karen insisted, but her voice was getting higher. Ma'am, even if you had legitimate concerns about a neighbor's property maintenance, you can't just enter their yard and install anything. That's trespassing and potentially destruction of property. Mike felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Officers, Karen said, her voice suddenly dropping to a whisper. I didn't want to mention this, but I'm genuinely afraid of what he might do. He's been watching my house, taking pictures of my property. I think he might be planning retaliation. Mike's jaw dropped. What? I'd never taken pictures of your house. He has a clear view of my breakfast nook from his yard, Karen continued, tears actually forming in her eyes now. I've seen him out there with his phone, and I'm scared he's documenting my daily routine. That's insane, Mike protested. I've been working on removing my pool. If I'm looking at anything, it's the giant mess in my own backyard. But Officer Martinez was now looking at Mike with increased suspicion. Sir, have you been taking photographs of your neighbor's property? No. I mean, maybe the pool area is visible in some pictures, but I'm documenting my own project. Karen was now in full victim mode, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she'd somehow produced. I just want to feel safe in my own home. All I did was try to preserve something beautiful for the community, and now I'm being harassed and threatened. Mike watched in horror as the situation continued to deteriorate. Somehow, Karen had managed to make herself look like a concerned citizen being terrorized by an unstable neighbor, while he looked like an aggressive man with a history of threatening behavior. Just as Officer Martinez was reaching for his handcuffs, Mike's next-door neighbor, Bob Martinez, no relation to the officer, came jogging over from his backyard, holding his tablet. Officers, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think you need to see this, Bob said, slightly out of breath. I've been watching this whole situation unfold from my kitchen window, and I recorded most of what happened this morning. Karen's face went visibly pale. That's illegal surveillance. It's my kitchen window looking into the yard next door, Bob replied dryly. Pretty sure I'm allowed to look out my own window and record what I can see from my own property. Officer Kim took the tablet and began reviewing the footage. The video clearly showed Karen entering Mike's backyard without permission, taking measurements, installing the stakes with what appeared to be pre-mixed concrete, and then switching into victim mode the moment Mike confronted her about trespassing. Well, this is illuminating, Officer Martinez said, watching Karen's performance on the small screen. Ma'am, this video shows you installing these markers after entering his property without permission. But Bob wasn't finished. Officers, I've got 3 days worth of this. Karen's been over there every morning since Mike started working on the pool. Yesterday, she tried to disconnect his drainage hose. The day before that, she was out there at 6 a.m. taking pictures of his equipment. That's completely taken out of context, Karen stammered, but her earlier confidence was evaporating rapidly. Officer Kim continued scrolling through the footage. Sir, do you have the audio for these recordings? Oh yes, Bob said, tapping the screen. You can hear everything, including Karen's conversation yesterday where she told Mrs. Chen that Mike was probably running some kind of illegal business and that she needed to document everything for the lawsuit. Mike felt a surge of vindication, but the best was yet to come. Bob pulled up another video from earlier in the week. "This one's my favorite," Bob said. You can see Karen in her yard with a measuring tape calculating sightlines from her breakfast nook to Mike's pool. Then she calls someone, sounds like a lawyer, asking about establishing prescriptive easements for scenic views. Officer Martinez looked at Karen with a mixture of disbelief and annoyance. "Ma'am, were you attempting to claim legal rights to your neighbor's pool?" Karen's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. "I was protecting community property values through legitimate legal channels. By trespassing, installing concrete barriers without permission, and filing false police reports." "False reports?" Karen's voice cracked. "He did threaten me." Bob helpfully replayed that morning's audio. Mike's voice came through clearly. "Get out of my yard right now, or I'm calling the police." The context made it obvious that Mike was simply asking a trespasser to leave his property. "Ma'am," Officer Kim said, closing the tablet, "based on this evidence, I'm placing you under arrest for criminal trespass, destruction of property, and filing a false police report." Karen's transformation was immediate and dramatic. The concerned citizen act vanished, replaced by the indignant rage Mike had suspected was lurking beneath the surface all along. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked as Officer Kim approached with handcuffs. "I was protecting the neighborhood. He's destroying property values. You can't arrest me for caring about the community." "Ma'am, you installed concrete footings in someone else's yard without permission," Officer Martinez said patiently. "That's destruction of property, regardless of your motivations." As Karen was led away, still protesting her innocence and threatening lawsuits against everyone present, Mike finally felt like he could breathe again. The neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle were now murmuring among themselves, and Mike caught fragments of their conversations, most of which seemed to involve variations of "I'd always thought Karen was a little crazy, but this." 3 weeks later, Mike's backyard looked completely different. Where the pool had been, Sarah's vegetable garden was already showing promising green shoots. Karen had pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges and been ordered to pay for the removal of her concrete installations, plus damages to Mike's lawn where the stakes had been installed. But the real vindication came when Mike received a letter from the city's actual code enforcement office. Apparently, Karen had filed multiple complaints about unauthorized demolition and environmental violations related to his pool removal. The inspector's report, filed after Karen's arrest, noted that Mike had followed all applicable regulations for above-ground pool removal and that no permits were required for his project. The report also included a note that made Mike laugh out loud. Complainant appears to have confused residential pool removal with commercial water feature installation regulations. No violations found. Property owner advised that neighbor complaints about aesthetic impacts are not enforceable under municipal code. Karen's house went up for sale a month later. The listing, Mike noticed with some amusement, specifically mentioned peaceful neighborhood setting and privacy-focused community. Mike never did find out if Karen actually bought decorative stones for her breakfast nook to complement his pool, but he did make sure to plant the tallest sunflowers he could find along the fence line where the pool used to be. Every morning he enjoyed his coffee while watching them grow, knowing that Karen's former aquatic centerpiece had been replaced with something that was actually his choice to put there. The neighborhood, meanwhile, seemed much more peaceful without Karen's self-appointed oversight. Mrs. Chen stopped by to apologize for getting caught up in the drama, and Bob became a good friend after their shared experience of dealing with Karen's antics. "You know," Sarah said one evening, admiring her thriving tomato plants, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually grateful to Karen." "How's that?" Mike asked, pulling a weed from between the pepper plants. "Well, if she hadn't made such a huge deal about the pool, we might have just let it sit there for another 3 years. Now look at this place. It's actually better than we ever imagined." Mike had to admit she was right. Sometimes it takes a completely unreasonable neighbor to help you realize what you really want in your own backyard. And sometimes justice does prevail, even when it takes security footage and a very patient police officer to make it happen. The only thing Mike regretted was that he'd never actually gotten to see Karen's famous PowerPoint presentation about pool preservation. Bob mentioned that she apparently spent hours on it, complete with charts about aquatic focal points and neighborhood scenic value metrics. But then again, Mike thought some experiences are probably better left to the imagination.